Hey, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brittney Chere to everyone today. Brittney started out with the Center for Brain and Cognitive Development as a master's student in educational neuroscience, and then went on to do her PhD in our lab over the course of the last 3 years, working on the effects of noise, the impact of noise on infant and adolescent learning and executive functions. And she is going to give us a talk today looking at learning amongst noise. Off you go.
Perfect. Thank you, Natasha. So this is mostly is on my PhD project, which I just finished and finished with Viva. So I'm officially done, but this is all work that I did with Natasha Kirkham. So hers truly. And so I'll just begin. Okay, so here we go. So this is really just to show you how when we think about noise.
I just want to let you know, Brittney, that there's a lot of background sound. I don't know if somebody's unmuted or.
I think, Natasha, you can mute. Oh, right, it's gone.
I've muted all. Oh,
okay.
Has it gone? Okay, great, thanks.
Perfect, thanks, Natasha. So just showing you the different kinds of external background noise that might be entering schools based on the location and community that they're in. So here you have central London or northern England in the countryside. And so just we really need to consider the different external sound sources that could be entering the schools. And then here, this is doing the same thing, but with internal noise. So the noise stemming from inside the classroom. And here you can see students doing a group project. And as you can see from their faces, there's no way this is a quiet group project. They're really enjoying it though. And then here we have more silent individual work. And so just thinking about the different kinds of noise levels in these environments. And so just taking a step in the time to define noise. So it can kind of be thought of as an unwanted sound that can subjectively annoy people and disturb people, and or that can then also objectively cause adverse psychological and physiological harm. And so just to highlight, so there's the annoyance, the subjective annoyance, and then this psychological, physiological harm, which in this talk, I'll be really considering cognition and executive function. And so just to make sure everyone's on the same page, executive function is a set of cognitive processes that are necessary for the cognitive control of behavior. So for instance, inhibitory control. So it's really just to achieve your goals. Okay. So the current evidence looking at and understanding how noise impacts on learning has really taken place within the classroom and has focused on primary school age children. And so we'll kind of be going over 2 review papers that have covered a lot of the research out there in case you want to read them for more detail. But so we have the first review by Shield and Dockrell. So they kind of talk about research that has found noise has impacted numeracy, reading, language, speech, and then just overall academic achievement. And then Clate et al. Did a more recent review, and then they broke it down into auditory versus non-auditory tasks. And so they found that noise impacts on perception of speech and listening comprehension. And then for non-auditory tasks, reading, writing, and short-term memory. And really what's key from these 2 papers, I think, is how they both conclude that long-term and chronic exposure to noise is likely to have impact on just general cognitive development. And so that's kind of what I'll be looking at a bit more. And so here we have a really recent meta-analysis, which basically, if you look here just at the section with children, so what we see is that, so for cognitive ability, we have here, this is kind of key on the side, but so the research currently has low quality evidence that noise impacts academic ability, and then very low quality evidence that noise affects attention, memory, and learning. And then executive function, here its noise has moderate quality evidence that it does not impact executive function. And then for reading and language, there is an association but then only low quality evidence for noise impacting fluid intelligence and general cognition. So my conclusion from this is really just that a lot more research is needed, and that what we have so far isn't quite enough to make conclusions either way, whether noise is negatively impacting on them or not. And so from all of this literature, my question really was, well, so it's been mostly focused on primary school age children, but what about adolescents? They're still learning, they still could be affected by this noise. So what is happening there? And then also, we've mostly focused on the school environment, but realistically, if noise within the school has all these long-term and big implications on cognitive development, then surely that should also be happening in the home environment. So what's happening there? So how is in-home noise causing annoyance and affecting cognitive and executive development? And then in particular, because this was a study that came about during the pandemic, our focus was on how is this impacting home learning, all these students who are now continuing their educations at home. And then from this study, we also wanted to consider then how does the effective in-home noise possibly have greater implications and might transcend the home and also lead to kind of impacts within the school learning. Okay, so first we'll just focus on the adolescent literature. And again, mostly this is focused on the school environment, and then we'll bring it to the home environment later on. So there's evidence that, sorry, just back up. We'll first kind of talk about noise and annoyance. So how I said before, when you think about the definition of noise, it can cause subjective annoyance, but then also cause cognitive harm. And so here we'll first focus on annoyance. So here there's been associations between the noise level and the noise annoyance that adolescents report. So unsurprisingly, the more noise there is, the more rates of annoyance adolescents report. And this is from 11 to 18-year-olds, and then another study at 13 to 15. And then if we consider annoyance to noise, depending on if it's internal or external noise, which we kind of talked about before. A study found annoyance to both internal and external. And then interestingly, another study found that there was more annoyance to external outside noise compared to internal noise that's derived from inside the classroom. And this is possibly due to predictability. So if you think about it, if say you have a student in front of you who's tapping their pencil on the desk, you can see that, you can predict when that sound is going to come. And so it might be, it's coming, so it's maybe a little less annoying, versus if you have an airplane outside that comes out above and it's very loud all of a sudden, but you don't know that it's coming. So it's unpredictable. And so that might be more annoying to the students. And their conclusion was that because they're more annoyed towards the external noise, then that should mean that if we reduce this external noise, then there will be less noise annoyance within the classroom. And a study by Ali, actually, they did restrict nearby traffic noise, so traffic and railways, and they did find that effectively reduced the noise levels within the classroom. So that could be a potential avenue for future research. So then when we consider noise annoyance and age, so you see that younger adolescents have reported more annoyance, but then also another study has found that older adolescents report more annoyance than their younger peers. So it's quite conflicting. But what I think is happening is that it's potentially due to other factors. So potentially cognitive demand of the task and cognitive ability, which we will come back to in a second. So once we talk through that a bit more, I'll bring back the points to this and talk you through it. So now considering noise and cognition, so the other avenue of how noise can influence and cause harm. So here, this is just a graph really to talk you through this quickly, so we're interested in how environmental noise affects cognition. And then within this, you have executive function. So because executive function is a subset of cognitive processes, just to clarify one more time. So when we're looking at this relationship, if you consider an individual, they have various abilities of cognitive control. And so if, I've lost my mouse. How this environmental noise is impacting their cognitive development really depends on where they're at, they're able to deal with this noise. So if you have a kid that has a higher cognitive ability, then they'll be more able to deal with this background noise and they'll be less impacted by it. But then again, this is circular. So this environmental noise that the children are exposed to is equally shaping their cognitive systems and mechanisms. And so if you think of a child who's exposed to lots of noisier environments, that input that they're constantly getting is going to shape how their brain is processing and dealing with that noise, versus the kid who's largely in a quiet environment, they're getting very different input. And so this is just to highlight this so that you can better understand everything we talk about later. And so when we think more about noise and cognition within the learning frame set, so to effectively learn amongst noise, you need to be able to inhibit the distracting information while also focusing your attention on the relevant information. And so this gives EF, so executive function, a key role in the ability to do this. And we do know that the development of executive function is very protracted, and so it goes well into late adolescence. And the effect of noise on learning is really going to depend on the cognitive demand of the task. And so what these 2 points are really saying is that, so older adolescents have a better ability to deal with the noise because their systems have better developed. But then equally, if you think about the cognitive demand on the task, so if they're doing a numeracy task, which takes a lot of focus and effort, if they have a bunch of noise at the same time, that's going to be quite difficult because it's using the same systems. But then if they're coloring or doing a drawing task, or I can't think of another easier task, but something that's a little less intense, then it might not be as distracting because they have those mechanisms available to combat the noise. And then, like I said, this I think is possibly explaining the difference in rates of annoyance between the older and younger adolescents. So it could be that depending on the task, older adolescents will report more annoyance because they'll be having, the resources will be spent elsewhere compared to then if they're kind of doing an equal, not very taxing task, then the older adolescents will do better and will be less annoyed by it, versus the younger adolescents might be more annoyed. And so if we think about executive function within learning specifically, so research has shown that executive function is linked very strongly to academic achievement all the way across the lifespan, across development. And that particularly found this with math and reading. And then the executive function mechanisms that they think are the most prominent involved in this are working memory, attention, flexibility, and then inhibitory control. And so here we have a study, one of the few that has looked at the impact of noise on learning within adolescents. And so this study looked at 11 to 16-year-olds, and they had them listen to a naturalistic recording of classroom noise that didn't have any verbal, so no speaking, and so nonverbal classroom noise. And so they listened to this through their headphones at 50, 65, and then 70 decibels. And so decibels are the energy of the sound. And so they did this while completing a short reading task or a control learning task. And so then their results were that at 50 decibels, they found that the older adolescents were generally performing better than their younger peers. But then at 65 decibels, I think they were quite surprised by this finding at first, but only the older adolescents' performance was negatively affected by this decibel level of the noise. And what they think was happening was that because again, this is being compared to the control learning task. So that the older adolescents were more focused and they're just more cognitively focused on the task and therefore basically trying harder. And so therefore the background noise was having more of an impact on them versus the younger peers. And then if we compare the 50 decibels and the 70 decibels, they found that all ages at this point answered less questions and were less accurate in the 70 decibel range. And so essentially at that point, the noise level was just too high and all students were affected by it. So in summary, because this was a lot, noise within the school is associated with rates of annoyance and with cognition and learning during adolescence. So that's the main summary to take away. So then our next questions that we had, which we talked about not too long ago, was how does in-home noise cause annoyance and affect executive function? So we know it's happening in the classroom, but what about the home? And if so, what does this mean for home learning during the pandemic? And then also, if there is an effect of environmental noise on executive function, does this transcend the home environment and then also have implications for learning within the school? Okay, so just like the school environment, you could consider the different homes and external environments that are creating noise, bringing in noise within the home, and how that might vary from child to child. And then equally, this is very much considering, again, this was within the pandemic. So the internal noise, if you have younger siblings who maybe don't have their own learning to do, so they're just playing, or parents trying to get some chores done, parents trying to take work calls while getting their caffeine intake, or maybe you have grandparents living with you to help with everything during the pandemic, and they started making dinner a bit early while you were finishing up your learning. I don't know about you, but hearing and smelling food would definitely distract me. So just considering kind of the chaos of it all and all the different kinds of noise they would be exposed to that in a classroom they wouldn't be. And here, this is just quickly to show the different locations that they might be studying. So do they have their own room? Do they have a desk? What is their setup and how might that be influencing them? And the different structures of how their learning is being guided, just highlighting the effects of the pandemic. So from all of this, I just wanted to clarify kind of the motivation for this current study and where we're coming from and what we were trying to achieve. So UNICEF estimated that 1.6 billion children from across the world were impacted by the pandemic in terms of their education, and they were attempting to continue their learning at home. So we know that the school is a structured learning environment that is largely created to reduce the infiltration and transmission of noise throughout the school to help children learn. And yet even then, we still have evidence that's really showing the negative impact of noise on learning, and that this could even have long-term negative consequences. So considering that, what then does this mean for a child trying to learn at home with all these different kinds of background noises and in a building that's not made to only serve children's learning, but many, many other functions? So this is a published study, which our hypotheses and analyses were pre-registered. And so this is just how you can find it, citation for it. And so getting into it, this was an online study. And so we had 129 adolescents aged between 11 and 18 complete the study. And so they filled out a socio-demographic questionnaire, a home environment and noise questionnaire. They did an audio check, which basically was to just make sure their headphones were working, they could hear the noise, and to set the level of the background noise. And then they completed 3 executive function tasks with different background noise, which we'll get into in a second. But just to point out, so the reason we used executive function tasks as a proxy for academic learning, there were 2 reasons. So one was that we chose tasks that measured shifting, inhibitory control, and working memory, which were the EF constructs that we talked about before that were really key for academic achievement. So what this means is that if we find an effect of background noise impacting their performance on these tasks, then likely this represents the scenario where this background noise is affecting their academic learning. So it's kind of a proxy for it. And also it was just quite impossible to work with teachers as they were so busy trying to do so much during the pandemic and help their students. So it wasn't really possible to use actual learning material from the classroom. Okay, so this on the left is really just to quickly highlight. So within research, we tend to have not enough diversity in our research. So the subjects that come in aren't diverse enough. And this is just to show largely the sample was white, and while there's a bit more variety in terms of the income versus what we normally find in the lab, there's clearly a large section of children that are not being represented. And so this is just really to say that this is research on specific children, and that there's not really enough yet to talk about all the children that you'd find in the classroom. So we're trying. And so here on the right-hand side, this is just to kind of go through the different homes that they were coming from our sample. So here you can see these are the different kinds of homes. So you have detached, semi-detached, terraced, and flat. And so here you can see we had quite a good variety of different homes. And so essentially this was quite a representative sample with children from many different kinds of homes across the UK. And then here you see that we were interested in the number of habitants in the home. And so if this changed during the pandemic compared to before, and we did see a small but significant increase. So that was interesting. And then here, so this is just going through our home environment and noise questionnaire. So we did just kind of talk through these first 2 points. So we did also record and have the students respond and tell us about the noise and how annoyed they are to noise compared to their peers. So if they think they get more annoyed or less annoyed than average, if they prefer their noise preference while studying. So if they prefer a quiet background or a noisier background, the noise level in their room that they've been studying in at home, and how annoyed they've been at this noise within their room. And then here, so this last number 7, so this is talking about, we created an overall home noise score. So what we did was we had 26 questions where we had the students talk about the different frequency of sound sources within their home. So this was using a Likert scale. So it was from not at all like our home to very much like our home. And an example question is, can you hear your neighbors while you're inside your home? Or do you have the TV on? Often questions like that. So just trying to get an understanding of the frequency of these different sound sources. And so this was all tallied up to give them an overall home noise score. Okay, so then this is looking at all these different factors that we just talked about. And so we'll start here. So what we found is that the higher the in-home noise score, oh, sorry, I think that's me getting a notification. Sorry, let me not do that poor form. I'm so sorry. Oh no, I just opened my email and said, quit. I did get out of that one. Okay, here we go back. So home noise score. So the higher their in-home noise score, the more removed they were from their neighbors. So that basically meant the less collective of a dwelling they lived in, and the more they would be like in a detached house without surrounding neighbors. And although this seems a bit counterintuitive, it actually does follow from previous research. And so the higher their in-home noise score, the more they prefer to study amongst noise, the higher their reported room noise level. So the more overall in-home noise they have, the higher the noise level in their room, and the higher they report room noise annoyance. So the higher the noise level, the more annoyed they are. And that does follow from the school literature that we talked about previously. What's interesting though, and I was a bit perplexed by at first, is how the more noise there is, the more they prefer to study amongst noise, but then the more they're also annoyed by it. And you could just say adolescents. But we tried to see if maybe it was that those coming from a noisier home, they either then liked this noise more or became much more annoyed to it. but that did not go through. That was not the answer to the question. We didn't find anything for that. So what I think might be happening is that perhaps they're used to this background noise, and so for them focusing in a very quiet environment would be difficult, but that they prefer certain kinds of background noise to have. And because they're in a very noisy home, there definitely are going to be the types of noise that they don't like and that can annoy them. And so it's a bit of both. But unfortunately, we just don't have more detailed information on all that, so we can't really speak more to that and kind of determine what's happening. So here we just have that the more inhabitants in the home, the less collective the dwelling. So really that's just saying the more people you have, the bigger space you need. So that makes sense. And then here, the higher the in-home noise score. Oh, I went the wrong way. The more they reported annoyance with the noise within their room, the more likely they are at being more sensitive to the noise. The more sensitive they are compared to their peers, then the more annoyed they are. And then also that links with having a higher noise level in their home. Okay, so going through the executive function tasks. So here we have the Wisconsin card sorting test. So this measures shifting, inhibition, and working memory. And I'll just quickly explain the tasks and how they work for anybody who doesn't know. So basically you have this, they got this target card, which they then had to match to these four above, either based on the number of shapes, the color of the shapes, or the type of shape. And there was always a fourth that didn't match on any of these. But they didn't know what they needed to match by. They had to figure it out. And then this rule changed every once in a while. I think it's every 10 trials. And then we have the backward digit span, which measures working memory. And so here they are shown a series of digits, which they then need to enter in backwards. And then the number of digits that they were shown would increase over time. So it got more and more difficult. And then once they made a certain amount of mistakes, the task would end. And then here we have the flanker inhibition, the flanker task, which measures inhibition. And so here they had to press a key to say if the central arrow was either facing left or right. And then these arrows surrounding it would either be congruent, so facing the same direction, or incongruent and facing the opposite direction. And so every adolescent completed each of these tasks, either with white noise throughout all of them or with environmental noise throughout all of them. So every kid only experienced one of these background noises. And so I'll just play you quickly what this sounded like. So this is the white noise. Oh, there we go. And then this was our environmental noise. And so the environmental noise was basically audio we created to emulate and sound exactly like a noisy home. So just sounds that you would naturally hear, to really make it as natural as possible. It's just a little snippet of it, so mostly film. That's just like it's playing in the background. Okay, so, and then sorry, our backward digit span didn't really translate well to online environments, so we won't really be talking about that. Okay, so what we did here is we took all of our adolescents and we separated them into either being in a younger group or an older age group, so we could compare the two. And then we also used their noise score. So that was from the questionnaire, their overall in-home noise score. And then here, this is just to show that we got a very big range. So from 86 to 45. And then we use this median split to group them into either being from a quieter or a noisier home. And so the flanker task was where we found our results. So we'll be talking through that. So this is just a reminder, the one that measured inhibition. So that's an executive function ability. And so here, this is looking at their efficiency score. So how efficient they were at correctly saying if the arrow was either pointing left or right. and like taking into account their reaction time, things like that, and accuracy. So here, just to note first that we found an overall effective age. So essentially the older adolescents, unsurprisingly, were more efficient at the task than the younger adolescents. However, when we take into account their home noise levels, so if they came from a quieter or a noisier home, what we find is that here, if they're from a quieter home, these adolescents are more efficient. It's confusing because it's the opposite of what you think, but lower is more efficient. That's why it's called a mean inverse efficiency score. So they're more efficient than the younger adolescents, but then those from noisier homes, they lose this advantage. And then here, when we look at, so this is their delta RT accuracy score. So really what this means is how their reaction time is impacted by their accuracy. And so here we found that so we split them again into quieter and noisier homes, and then this is looking at the two different age groups. And so these are the younger adolescents, and so those from a noisier home have a lower delta RT accuracy score than those from a quieter home, sorry. And what this means really, because that doesn't quite make sense, is that those from a quieter home, they're essentially taking more time to be accurate than their peers from a noisier home. So that's what that is showing. And so then I'll just talk you through our main conclusions from that. Sorry, the sun is really shining on me, so sorry if I'm very bright. So clearly, this demonstrates that the home environment influences subjective perception of noise. So we found that the higher the noise score, the higher the annoyance reportings, and so that fully goes with the school literature. Then we have that there was no direct effect of background noise on executive function task performance, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. And then both younger and older adolescents showed evidence that consistently being in a noisy home is having these long-term effects on executive function. And BDS did not work. So then just taking all of that and then relating it to learning within the school and what this means. So we know is that home learning may not have been affected by the environmental noise in the home that was present at the time of learning. So when they were doing their studying at home, which would be positive. We can't fully make this claim yet because we didn't have a perfect control. So we had white noise as our control, but because we needed to account for the actual noise within the home that would be present when they were doing the task, we thought having white noise would at least block that out and give a kind of an even background noise that those participants would be experiencing. So this is a potential possibility that they were not impacted. And so we also know that exposure to high levels of in-home noise has long-term effects on executive function, and that this does extend beyond the home and into the school. So because this wasn't based on the background noise present, but rather what they experience day to day from their home environment, this has impacted their executive function and affected how they were able to do the tasks. And so this would also affect how they're learning within the school. And because this was looking at inhibition, so in any task within the school that would require inhibitory ability, the background noise could be affecting these children. And then depending on if they're from noisy or quieter homes, how they would deal with that. So we found that adolescents aged all the way from 11 to 18 were impacted by this long-term exposure to in-home noise. So it's this entire period of adolescence, not just the older or the younger. And so this is really just to highlight that when we're looking at how noise within the school is impacting on learning, we also need to consider what's happening at home and what these children are bringing in from that experience and how that will then interact with their ability to learn within the school. Okay, so then just to quickly go over another question that came up in my PhD, which is looking at infancy, and I promise, relate everything to learning within the school. And so what this will mean basically for once they start formal education based on the findings we got. So our main question really was, so if there is this clear evidence for a negative impact of environmental classroom noise on school-age children, then what does this mean for an infant whose brain's very plastic, still very much developing, and where any negative impact at this age would then have cascading effects on later learning and development. So they would bring these effects and how their brains been developing into the classroom. So this was a very large study with lots of different variables, but I'll just quickly give you the highlights, essentially. So this is just to say we looked at infants aged 10 to about 13 months old. And so first we're going to look at how noise impacts attention. And so just to point out here, we actually, this was pre-pandemic, so we were able to directly measure the noise levels in the home. So these are actual decibel levels, so the energy of the sound that the infant is being exposed to within their home. And again, like we had before, we grouped them into coming from noisier or quieter homes. And this did kind of line up really nicely with how we would label environments as either being like kind of louder or quieter. So that worked out well. And so we had them complete an eye tracking task. And so I'll just quickly kind of cover this just so you can understand the findings a bit better. So they were shown, they had 3 different shape pairs, and one would appear in a window, and then there was an interval, and then after a certain period of time, there was a probability within the shape pair of which window it would appear next. So each of these shapes had different probabilities of which window they would appear in most. And so we definitely know, a lot of Natasha's research has shown that infants very much can learn and learn these different probabilities between the shapes. And so we just use this task to see how would background noise influence their ability to learn and pay attention to these shape locations. And so we either have them complete this in silence or with an acute background noise, which sounded like this. It was really just a cell phone buzzing. And then we had very similar chronic background noise conditions. So this is just, the acute. So it was this phone buzzing sound that kind of sporadically and randomly played in the background. So they didn't know when to predict it, but it wasn't constant. And then this chronic noise was just a constant background noise of, again, naturalistic environmental noise that they'd find within their home. Just play it quickly. Here's somebody walking in the background and a bit of humming. And again, nothing in these recordings is an airplane. There's no language because we couldn't control for what the infant would be exposed to. So there's no speech in it. Okay, so what we found is, I did forget to mention, so the acute noise, it actually ended up working as an attention getter. So it got their attention and helped them learn and focus rather than what we'd intended. So for all intents and purposes, this is to help them learn and focus. So here we can see that, so this is their saccadic latency. So I'll just actually maybe show you here. So once they see the shape and then this one appear, how quickly do they then look at this window where the shape is? And then supposedly the faster they look at it and react to it, the more they're learning that it's actually going to show up there. And so we're able to capture this. So here you can see that we did find a significant difference. So if overall infants were faster to look at where that shape was going to appear in the acute condition, so that noise was helping them focus and look at that shape. Whereas in the chronic condition, it was very distracting and it kind of slowed them down to learn where that shape was going to appear. And then here, if we break them down into either coming from a noisier or quieter home, you can see that those from a quieter home show the same trend. But then if they came from a noisier home, they actually just blocked out the helpful and the unhelpful sound. Oh, sorry. And so really linking this to education, because I promised that. So what this is showing is that experience with in-home noise is clearly impacting infant attention, with infants from quieter homes being affected by the background noise, and then those from noisier homes kind of blocking it out. And so if you imagine these same infants then entering formal education a bit later, they might be showing the same pattern because that's the environment that their brain's been developing in. And so perhaps, we don't know this, I haven't tested this, but this is just a possibility. And why it's relevant that we research this further is that those from noisier homes, when they're in a school and they're focused on a task, because we know they block out the sound, maybe they don't hear the teacher giving them further instructions, and this might appear as the student's disinterested, not paying attention. But also that means that they might be less distracted by the irrelevant noise and can better focus on their task if there's lots of noise around. And a child that grew up in a quieter home, if they're focused on a task, then they are being able to be grabbed by, their attention's able to be grabbed by their teacher and get further instructions, for example, or, but then equally, then they might be more distracted by the background noise. And so these are just things to consider when we're, again, thinking about learning in school and their background of how they've been growing up and the environment that they've developed in, largely within their home. And then quickly, as we're checking time, quickly going over sleep and sensory processing. So we know sleep and sensory processing are important for learning. So sensory processing for kind of taking in the noise or blocking it out and being able to focus on a task versus, and then sleep is important for cognition and just everyday functioning. Sorry, that was very quick. But so here what we found is that, so this is looking at the impact of noise on auditory sensory processing. So the higher the average noise level, and again, this is true decibels that we measured from the home, and the more fluctuation in the noise, so that's the more it goes from high to low and high to low, that they have within the main room in their home that they spend a lot of time in, the better the infant's auditory processing was. And then here quickly with sleep. So we have, here was again the higher fluctuation. So if there's more up and down within the bedroom that they're sleeping in, then the more time they spend awake at night. And interestingly, it didn't relate to what waking them up. So the noise wasn't waking them up, but it was possibly then keeping them from going back to sleep. And that's why they spent more time awake at night. And so what does this mean for later education? So when these children enter school, when we consider auditory processing, so those coming from a noisier home will possibly have better auditory processing abilities. And so perhaps if they are focusing on the teacher, they can hear him or her amongst the noise better if there's noise around. Perhaps they can learn better through auditory information than their peers from quieter homes. Again, this is just possibly, we haven't measured this, but why it would be important to look at this. And then when we consider sleep, those coming from noisier homes will perhaps have worse quality of sleep. So that means more awakenings. And so they might have more difficulty effectively learning at school during the day and compared to their peers from a quieter home. I think yep, that's it. So thank you very much for all listening, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to your questions. And then I'll
have like an actual clap from me.
I'll stop sharing my screen. Wrong thing.
So thank you so much, Brittney.
Leave the meeting. Sorry, I was about to leave the meeting.
Don't leave the meeting. You might have to answer some questions. If you guys would like to either raise your hands or pop some stuff into the chat bar, we have a few minutes left for some questions if anybody has them. I was really very impressed by how you pulled all this stuff together. It's a really lovely set of work. I see that Rebecca has a question.
Yes, and I had to switch rooms halfway through, so I'm sorry if you explained it, but what went wrong with the backward digit span? Because that's such a shame, because it will involve verbal rehearsal, which is, you can imagine how it'd be disrupted. So I just was wondering.
Yes, the key point, I forgot to say, I just realized that, is that they performed this task without researcher supervision. So we were also trying to see how well we could then run these online tasks, with the height of the pandemic and getting all excited about doing online experiments, how well that could work with having the adolescents individually do them on their own, which meant that they could just write down the numbers. So that was a shame. But so it could be done online. It's just that you would need researcher supervision to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's a bit of a live and learn situation with that stuff. Turns out they cheat.
Yeah, I do remember I told them that if they did that, so I was trying to keep them from doing it, that it would take them longer to do the task. If they don't do it, it's just going to be worse for you.
Yeah,
it is such a shame. I see Lucy has just said in the chat that they had the same problem with digit spam online.
Yeah. And Jessica Massonier has a question. Please go ahead, Jess.
Hello, Jess. Oh, we can't hear you.
I was muted, thank you.
Oh.
Thank you, Brittney. It was really interesting to have this overview of your work and also an update on what you've been doing with Natasha. So I have one comment and one question.
Yeah.
One comment because I wanted to share something that we found in a study with Natasha as well that relates to what you said in terms of auditory processing.
Yeah.
So it was on a different population, but we did a survey with primary school children. And the teachers reported the attentional skills of the children, and there was a subscale called attentional activation control, and basically it was correlated with noise annoyance reported by the children. So what the teachers were rating the children as having more activation control in terms of their attention, the children were less annoyed by noise.
Interesting.
So I think it was fitting with what you were saying.
Yeah.
My question is about your first study with adolescents. How do you interpret the effects about the adolescents being in quieter home, being more efficient?
Quieter homes being more.
If I understood it correctly.
So it was that it wasn't overall they were more efficient. It was when you look at their different age groups. So if you then took into account, so overall, the older adolescents were more efficient. And then when you consider their home environment, so if they're from a noisier or quieter home, then those from a quieter home still show the same trend, but then those from a noisier home then lose this advantage and they perform just as well as the younger adolescents. So essentially something about the noisier home environment is impacting their ability to do the task as efficiently.
But I guess the flip side of the interaction is that if you look at the young adolescents only, the ones in a quieter home are doing better, right?
Sorry, let me just pull that up.
That's how I read it as well.
Those in a quieter home were doing better. It's the mean inverse efficiency score, so it's flipped. Is that what you mean? Just that the younger
Can you show the graph again?
Yes, yeah, I can do that. There we go. Let me make that big so you can see it there. Okay, this one here.
Okay, so I kind of, my memory was the reverse, but so the difference within age group were not significant. Is that right?
Here they are. It's this one here when we're looking at their accuracy reaction time scores. So this didn't have an overall age effect, but then here this is the, so basically this is showing that those from quieter homes are taking more time to react to be accurate.
Is that the one that you were thinking about, Jessica, or was that the other one?
Yeah, so is it that the adolescents who were in noisier homes, basically they were doing less well because they were rushing through the test or answering more quickly?
So. Yeah, I think that's what I think is happening based on the findings, yeah.
Do you think it could be because overall then it's becoming a bit too much noise.
Do you mean the
in the
background?
sense that you're adding, sorry.
This is regardless of the background noise that they were listening to through their headphones. So this is just to do with the home noise that they experience on an everyday basis.
But they were still listening to some noise.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, Jessica, that's an interesting point. It could just be that's just way too much. You've got.
Because I'm thinking, yes.
Mm.
We're thinking of these papers where you have moderate noise around, like, 60, 75 could be okay, but then if you reach like 80 decibels, that could be too noisy, and then basically it's just in terms of attention, the participants can just rush through the task and end it quickly because it's a bit too annoying. So I'm wondering if there was background noise already in their home when they did your study, maybe there was overall, it was a lot of noise.
Yeah. So that's the issue with this, is that our control was white noise. It wasn't true quiet. And that was just because we just couldn't control the noise within their home. So even if we told them to kind of be in a quiet environment as much as they could, because we weren't present, I couldn't tell you if that happened. And so we just thought it was better to have a white noise to at least block it out and then make it as equivalent across the control condition as possible. But yeah, it is one of those really annoying parts that makes it a little hard to interpret the findings.
No, I don't mean it's annoying. I think it's interesting, actually. And it's good that you had this control, because then they also had something in the experiment in the other group.
Yeah, exactly. Ideally, I would have wanted all three. But I think what you're saying is, I agree with that, and it makes sense, because it also then goes with, can I go all the way back with that, a previous study with adolescents here, where by the time you get to 70 decibels, it's just impacting everyone. And so like it got to the point where it's just too noisy. And
we have sort of interestingly similar findings with babies as well, that when you take their home noise environment into account, suddenly those from a noisier home sort of lose certain advantages, or quiet homes lose advantages. I mean, things sort of shift around. They look quite similar until you take their home noise environment into account. Yeah. We have a question from Lucy in the chat bar that says, do you think choosing your own preferred type of noise, for example, music whilst studying, could affect learning?
So I think that would kind of then lead into, let me go to it quickly now that I have this open. So here, where I think I can't really say, because we didn't really ask them about specific noises that annoyed them or that they preferred. So I think there's a very big distinction between a noise that is unwanted versus a noise that's there in the background to help them. And so I just can't quite make the distinction, but I don't think so. If that helps them, then I think that's okay.
Yeah, I think that is quite interesting. I was thinking about that again, actually, when this particular table came up, that there is certainly, when they say, oh, they like to prefer to study amongst noise, but they also say that they're annoyed by it, they could be thinking about two different things.
Yeah.
Right. They could be thinking, oh, I like to study to my favorite music. And interestingly, Lucy, we found in a previous study with a previous master's student that adolescents listening to music with lyrics really it works for them. Whereas if you do the same study with adults, they have to have the lyrics taken out in order to concentrate.
Oh, wow.
So I mean, it's a real generational thing, I think. Yeah. I think, good point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting. It shapes my arguments I used to have with my son, who insisted on studying with music, and I told him it wouldn't help, and he told me it would. So clearly he was right.
My teenagers always have one ear pod in, and they're listening to music in one ear pod, and they're talking to me with another, and they're reading something, and it makes me feel insane watching it, but apparently it works. So yeah. Are there any more questions? I'm sort of cognizant of the fact that we're chatting away and it's coming up to 5 o'clock. Well, if not, I'd like to just say thank you so much to Brittney, who managed to get an incredible amount of data through a really complicated time where we could not bring our subjects into the lab, and it was very hard to get things going. And I think you have a really nice amount of data, group of data, and you've told a really good story with it. So very much appreciate you coming and talking to us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This has been really nice.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. And we'll see you all next week for our final seminar looking at maths, and that will be very interesting. So please come back next week.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye.